He said he used to be a Navy corpsman kind of man they pulled aside after the fact. They hired him because he didn't get sick around bodies, didn't ask questions when the work turned ugly. That was the job, clean up what shouldn't be there. But the details did not match the usual UFO lore. One account talked about bodies in the desert, another talked about a craft held sideways in a hydraulic rig, a third described interview transcripts from beings that would not explain where they came from. The last one sounded like a dying contractor trying to clear his conscience. Different places, different years, different vocabularies. But every one of them pointed at the same thing. Whatever was hidden had been sitting close enough to touch. I used to lurk on that old 4chan board back in the early 2000s when I was still a young man hungry for anything that felt bigger than the world I knew. I chased every story about lights in the sky and things that didn't belong here. Life moved on. I became a Navy corpsman, then an EMT, and I stopped looking for proof because the job in front of me was already too much some nights. The years blurred into shifts and calls that left little room for wondering what else might be out there. Early in 2021, a friend I hadn't seen in years reached out. He said his people were looking for someone who could keep their mouth shut, handle bodies without freezing up, and still keep an open mind about what they might be looking at. I met the group in a quiet diner outside Tucson. They asked straight questions about what I'd seen in trauma bays and what I could live with keeping quiet. The short version is I've been working retrievals for them ever since. We go in after a downed UAP is cleared for entry. My partner and I collect whatever biological material is left, bag it and get it out before anyone else shows up. My first recovery came 3 weeks after I signed on. We flew into a dry wash north of Alamogordo just after midnight. The craft had clipped a ridge and come down in pieces, but the main hull was still intact enough to seal a perimeter. I suited up with hands that wouldn't stop shaking until I stepped inside. The air hit me warm and metallic, and I realized the job wasn't about wonder anymore. It was about moving fast and not asking why the blood on the deck didn't match anything I'd trained on. We operate mostly in the empty stretches between small towns in New Mexico and Arizona. The places are chosen because nobody drives through them after dark. Most of the craft we reach are already cooling when we arrive. The team sets a perimeter, we suit up and we move in. Over time I noticed the crashes clustered along the same remote corridors year after year, almost as if the routes themselves were fixed and the pilots never learned the terrain. The inside is always tighter than it looks from the outside. Everything curves. Storage panels fit whatever they were built to hold, and there's never any wasted space. The engine shielding sits right in the middle, big and blunt, so you have to work around it on your hands and knees. I'm 6'1" and I still end up crawling through sections like I'm back in a helicopter fuselage after a hard landing. The air smells like hot metal and something sweet that doesn't belong in any crash I've worked before. We've pulled tools out of these wrecks that don't match anything in our inventory. Some of them respond to touch the way a living thing would. One piece we recovered cut through a steel plate like it was paper, then stopped the moment the operator stepped back. The optics we found once let a man read a serial number on a vehicle half a mile away through heavy brush at night. They look like ordinary lenses until you use them. Then the distance just collapses. We've also seen cutters that reshape metal without heat and survey rods that map invisible seams in the ground. The bodies we recover are usually the crew, small, thin, and already gone by the time we reach them. We've learned to work fast because the tissue starts to break down quicker than anything terrestrial. We bag what we can, tag the implants when they're still intact, and load everything into sealed containers. Most of those implants go dead the second we try to separate them from the host. Whatever keeps them alive is tied to the body. The ones that survive transport often power down the moment we open the bags at the facility. 4 times now I've found human abductees still inside the craft when we entered. They were laid out on the same kind of tables the crew uses. The restraints grow right out of the surface like threads, wrapping the wrists, ankles and neck. One woman had a fresh incision along her side and a small device still embedded under the skin. She never woke up. We carried her out the same way we carried the others. Every one of them had been examined and then left behind when the craft came down. None of them ever made it to a hospital. The last retrieval changed how I think about all of it. We came up on a craft that had hit hard and rolled. The entry team cut through the hull and we dropped in. The central compartment was wrecked, panels torn loose and equipment scattered. In the middle of the mess was a table like the ones we'd seen before, only longer. Strapped to it with the same grown restraints was a tall being. He had to be close to 7 feet if he'd been standing. His limbs were long and his skin had a faint grey sheen under the emergency lights. He was naked and the restraints had pulled tight across his chest and throat. The back of his skull was crushed. Whatever hit him had come from behind and it had been enough. The table had tried to adjust his position even after the impact. One of the restraint threads was still moving slowly, trying to shift his head into a better angle for whatever procedure they'd been running. My supervisor had told me once that we'd seen other species before, but this was the first time we'd seen one treated the way we treat the human abductees. They had taken him the same way they take us. We cut the restraints and moved him out like the rest. He was heavier than he looked. On the way back to the facility, I kept thinking about how the table had still been trying to hold him steady even after he was dead. It felt like the same cold efficiency we'd seen with the people we'd recovered. Whatever these craft are doing, it isn't just collection. It's study, and they don't seem to care who ends up on the table. I still do the job because leaving isn't an option anyone has ever made work. The pay is steady and the silence is required. Most nights I tell myself that's enough. Some nights I come back to the old places and wonder whether any of it will ever be enough to tell.
I quit in February of 2018. There was no exit interview, no paperwork explaining what I had seen or why it mattered. I packed what little I kept from the office and drove home. The silence afterward felt heavier than anything they had shown me inside. For months afterward, I kept waking at the same hour the shift changes used to happen, expecting to hear the low hum of the monitoring systems even though I was already miles away from the site. The decision to leave had come together slowly, built from too many short rotations and too little explanation about what any of it was supposed to achieve in the long run. I wrote about it later on an old image board thread. I needed to put the details somewhere they could sit without coming back at me every night. Putting the words down brought back the exact layout of the rooms I had tried not to memorize, and the way certain conversations stopped the moment I walked in. I kept the account short at first because I still half expected someone to knock on the door and tell me the whole thing had been a mistake. Once the first replies arrived, I realized the story was going to stay where I left it, so I added the rest in pieces over the following weeks. The interview happened in a house that was never meant to look lived in. A quiet residential street, blinds drawn, furniture that looked like it had been purchased the week before. They called it a skiff for the day. One man met me at the door, another waited inside the room they had cleared of anything personal. They gave me the agency name at the start. I had never heard it before, and I have never said it out loud since. They told me that was the correct choice. The men spoke in the same measured tone the whole time, as if they had already rehearsed every question and every possible answer I might give. They already knew I understood the basic premise. Non-human craft, recovered materials, programs that stayed off any official budget line. The man across the table mentioned an older contingency once, almost in passing. If a real threat reached the mainland, the work we did would be set aside for something older and simpler. He did not elaborate and I did not ask. The statement landed without emphasis, yet it stayed with me through every later assignment because it implied entire sections of the work could be discarded without notice if circumstances changed. I spent the next several years inside a facility that existed inside another facility. The craft was kept in a sealed bay with its own power and monitoring systems. Being near it for more than a few hours at a time produced a pressure behind the eyes that did not fade quickly. The team that ran active tests kept shorter shifts than the rest of us because of it. The outer perimeter looked like any other secure building on the larger campus, but once you passed the second checkpoint, the corridors narrowed and the signage disappeared. Schedules were staggered so that different groups rarely overlapped except at the main doors. The object itself was roughly 4 meters across at its widest point, and shaped like a four-sided top without the stem. One large panel had been missing when it arrived. The recovery team never located it. Some of the engineers argued the piece had functioned as a stabilizer during flight. Others believed it served as a focusing element for whatever system generated lift. Either way, the craft sat incomplete. The absence of that single section meant every test had to account for an imbalance that could not be corrected, and the logs always carried a note about the unknown effect on performance. They mounted it in a hydraulic rig built to rotate the object through every axis. The frame was larger than the craft itself, heavy steel arms and counterweights that let operators lock it at any angle. For weeks I assumed the rig was part of the original vehicle until someone corrected me during a shift change. The craft was usually stored on its side because that was the position its weight preferred. The intended flight orientation was vertical, nose or point down depending on how you measured it. Watching the rig move the object felt like seeing an oversized gyroscope being tested for balance rather than an artifact being studied for its original purpose. The outer skin was a single alloy cast in sections that matched the internal geometry exactly. No seams, no fasteners visible from the exterior. The material properties never appeared in any metallurgy textbook I had access to. Small samples taken from the edges showed consistent behavior under stress that did not match anything on the periodic table we had cataloged, yet the results were filed without further comment once the initial measurements were recorded. Weapons research occupied its own corridor and had been folded into the Space Force structure shortly before I left. The integration did not improve conditions. Turnover was constant. When someone was injured, the claim went through a private contractor rather than a government channel. The work itself was crude. One test sequence involved mounting a nuclear device to a scaled propulsion section and recording what survived the detonation. No one on that team expected clean data. They only wanted to see whether the field around the craft would hold or collapse. The corridor stayed locked at both ends during those sequences, and the rest of us were routed through side passages until the all-clear was given. Navigation research stayed separate. Every recovered vehicle used the same basic system. It mapped discrete points in the surrounding volume and calculated the shortest path through space-time that avoided detected obstacles. The calculation treated air, water, and vacuum as equivalent mediums. It also adjusted for the craft's own position in time, shifting the route by fractions of a second when the numbers demanded it. The logic resembled a three-dimensional routing algorithm more than any guidance software we had built ourselves. The code reviews never produced a working duplicate, only longer lists of parameters whose purpose remained unknown. I watched one recorded flight path where the object simply ceased to occupy the space it had been in. At the same moment, the tracking solution jumped to a new set of coordinates several kilometers away. No visible acceleration occurred. The logs only showed the destination point changing after the fact. Later, I read Commander Fravor's account of the same behavior. He had moved to cut the object off at its projected location. Instead, the object appeared at the point he had been heading toward, as if it had already solved for his intended move. That pattern suggested something larger than individual craft. If the objects in our atmosphere were not debris, then the volume they occupied might serve as a perimeter. We would not need to be destroyed to be contained, we would only need to be studied while the exits remained watched.
I had spent years doing fieldwork in places where the stories people told about their ancestors were treated as seriously as the data we collected on kinship structures and ritual. That background is what got me pulled into the project. A colleague from the university reached out in early 2017 and said a government-adjacent research effort needed someone who could handle sensitive cultural material without trying to force it into familiar categories. They offered a good salary and a fast track through the clearance process. I took the offer because the work sounded like an extension of what I already did, only applied to something that might not be human at all. My informal reading in philosophy had already trained me to sit with ideas that refused to settle into neat categories, and that habit proved more useful than any ethnography course once the files started arriving. The first months were nothing but forms, background checks, and training on how to handle material that could never leave the facility. By the time I walked into the medium-sized office suite in early 2018, I still had no clear picture of what we were studying. 6 other researchers already sat at their stations. One was assigned to bring me up to speed. We passed through 2 layers of biometric checks every morning and worked under constant monitoring. I spent the first week reading files that had already been screened for relevance. On the 4th day, my trainer told me the subject was an exotic intelligence of unknown origin. The goal was to assemble everything into one report focused on behavior, social structure, and apparent intentions, something that could eventually be shown to people outside the program. That single sentence changed the texture of every document I touched afterward. I asked the obvious questions and got measured answers. We were not to speculate beyond the material we were given. We were allowed to assume that their actions could be understood in human terms and that the data itself was reliable. After that conversation, I was given a stack of transcripts and told to read without interruption. The shock lasted 2 days. Then the work settled into routine: retrieve a document under escort, annotate what it contributed to society or motivation questions, return it, repeat. Most files were tangential. We were slowly building a usable body of knowledge from fragments. Each annotation forced me to decide whether a detail belonged under social structure or under intention, and the boundary between those 2 headings kept shifting as I read further. The beings themselves were described with striking consistency across sources: diminutive humanoids, large heads, reduced facial features, very large eyes sometimes covered by a dark transparent membrane, average height around 5 feet, 3 long fingers and an opposable thumb, 4-toed feet. They wore thin, high-collared garments, usually blue or gray, and boots. They had no visible reproductive organs or digestive exit, waste left through the skin. They consumed only a specific liquid nutrient that human substitutes could not replace. No 2 descriptions matched exactly on skin tone or the pattern of ridges along the upper back, yet the core anatomy stayed the same, which made the small variations feel more like individual signatures than errors in reporting. Biological samples recovered from craft showed ordinary cellular structure and DNA. That fact kept several competing origin stories alive. Some colleagues favored an Earth origin, others argued both we and they descended from a much older common source. The interview subjects never gave a straight answer when asked directly. They would shift the topic or give responses that contradicted earlier statements in the same session. We recorded the contradictions and moved on. Those contradictions became their own category in the margins of the report, a running note that the origin question might simply lie outside the frame we were using. Their technology appeared to rest on an artificial lattice integrated into the nervous system. In the transcripts, the subjects could sense one another through walls and cause retrieve tools to respond without physical contact. The same tools remained inert for human handlers. The lattice is built from common elements, yet it produces effects we cannot explain with current models. The craft themselves varied widely. Some were reflective orbs that appeared for seconds or followed aircraft before vanishing. Others were egg-shaped and occasionally carried living occupants and Earth biological samples. Discs and crescents appeared less frequently and were usually empty when recovered. Each shape seemed tuned to a narrow task, so that the variety itself became evidence of deliberate specialization rather than random design. The interviews were the part of the work that stayed with me longest. Subjects had been taken from both crashes and deliberate landings. Once separated from their craft, they could not be sustained indefinitely. They required the specific liquid food and proximity to their own kind. Without those conditions, they weakened and communication became difficult. The method was telepathic. The interviewer would sit across from the subject, receive impressions, then speak the exchange aloud for recording. The process required intense concentration from the interviewer and deteriorated as the subject declined. Watching that decline recorded in the transcripts made the ethical cost of the project impossible to set aside at the end of each day. From those transcripts we assembled a picture of how their society functions. They do not maintain fixed hierarchies. Instead, they form a shifting composite awareness made of many individual minds linked through the same lattice technology. New individuals are created with specific capacities as needs arise. The result is something closer to a single distributed organism than to a collection of separate people. That picture explained why the beings answered questions about their own identities in ways that sometimes seemed to include the interviewer as part of the same awareness, and why separation from the group produced such rapid physical failure. Their understanding of reality centers on a unitary consciousness that underlies time, space, and physical law. Individual minds are temporary loops within that larger activity. Evolution increases the complexity of those loops until they can support self-reflection. The beings see their role as accelerating that process wherever life exists. They view death as the dissolution of a loop and the return of its accumulated experience to the whole. That belief appeared to give them a measure of calm even while their physical condition deteriorated in custody. Reading those passages repeatedly left me unable to treat the usual human categories of individual survival and collective purpose as entirely separate. They offered no clear statement on why they chose Earth or how long their activity here has continued. When pressed, answers became vague or contradictory. We noted the pattern and included it in the report as an unresolved feature of the data. The final version was completed in late 2019. I was released from the project shortly afterward with the usual reminders about disclosure rules. Since then I have watched the public conversation from a distance, recognizing pieces of what we assembled but unable to point to any single source that would prove the work ever happened. The habit of treating contradictions as data rather than noise has stayed with me, and it makes ordinary conversations about ordinary topics feel oddly incomplete.
I never planned on saying any of this out loud. I kept my head down for 38 years because that was the deal. Then the doctors gave me 8 months and the deal stopped making sense. I have a stack of documents I cannot hand over to any FOIA office, and I have no interest in arguing with people who never sat in the rooms where the decisions were made. I am writing this because the field is drowning in half-truths told by men who never built a single working device. The choice came after watching the same patterns repeat on colleagues whose names never reached the public. Their labs closed overnight and their families paid the price while the gatekeepers kept moving forward. I graduated with an electrical engineering degree from a school in the South. They recruited me before the ink was dry on the diploma. The pitch was simple. They did not care about grades as much as whether I could stay quiet and whether I could see around corners. Within a month, I was on a black program doing microelectronics and pulsed power. The work was compartmentalized so tightly that even the people paying the bills did not know the full picture. New arrivals learned quickly that questions about other teams led to immediate removal from the project and reassignment to open work with lower clearances. In his telling, good engineers got their labs pulled, their funding cut, and their reputation shredded. He named Jay Stratton and Lou Elizondo as the people holding the scissors. Lou had already been inside multiple wave programs long before anyone heard the letters AAT. The source singled Stratton out as worse, saying he made it personal and blocked funding for approaches that threatened the official story. One of those approaches was rotating capacitors, the same idea the Soviets chased under the name rotational gravitation. They treated rotating masses as emitters and receivers of gravitational waves. We did the same work, only we never let it leave the classified world. I helped build one of the test articles in a private Bay E lab. The rig used Tesla turbines to spin the magnets, plasma toroids for containment, microwave injection, and banks of high-voltage capacitors. Total build cost came in under $3 million. When we ran it, we measured kilowatts of gravitational wave output through electromagnetic sensors because the effect shows up as a curvature in space-time itself. No metamaterials required, just careful timing of rotating fields and the right handling of the EM vector potential. We proved the principle over and over. The data stayed inside and the hardware was disassembled before the next fiscal quarter began. I still lose sleep over the men and women who tried to publish the same basic science in the open and watch their careers end. Hal Puthoff once told Joe Rogan we had more than 10 recovered craft. He insisted the real number sat in the hundreds across more than 2,000 legacy programs. Most of them are still chasing the same rotating mass and capacitor effects that were already working in small labs 20 years ago. In his version, gatekeepers kept the basic physics classified so large contractors could own the breakthroughs. Lockheed, Boeing, Raytheon, and the rest all have their own versions now. None of it is being offered to the public because the funding flows only through channels that protect proprietary claims. The source said he used to give Lou the benefit of the doubt. I thought maybe he was trying to thread a needle between national security and disclosure. I do not think that anymore. The pattern is too consistent. Careers destroyed, families broken, papers buried. Jay Stratton never showed any hesitation about any of it. Sean Kirkpatrick simply repeated what he was told. Ron Pandolfi has done the same for decades. In his telling, these were not accidents of bureaucracy. They were choices that kept the work inside the same small circle of cleared contractors deciding which ideas survived to the next budget cycle. I realize I am running out of time to watch the same cycle repeat. The next generation deserves the chance to run open experiments instead of watching the same papers get stamped classified every 10 years. The physics is not exotic warp drives or negative energy. It is ordinary electrokinetic engineering once you stop forcing closed current loops and Lorentz symmetry on every circuit. Thomas Townsend Brown was already measuring the effect in the 1920s with asymmetrical capacitors. The Soviets picked up the rotational side and kept going. We did the same work in private and then locked the door behind the people who asked questions. I watched rotating mass rigs produce measurable weight changes in vacuum chambers while the results were filed under internal reports that never reached peer review. The decision to classify came after the first successful runs showed repeatable force without propellant. Teams that tried to replicate the setup on the outside found their grant applications denied by reviewers who cited national security without ever seeing the data. That single step turned a laboratory curiosity into a permanently restricted subject. The gatekeeping extended to zero-point energy approaches that relied on manipulating the electrokinetic vector potential without arbitrary gauge fixes. Engineers who proposed test articles using only conventional components were told their work duplicated classified efforts already underway. Their equipment was confiscated and the investigators reassigned. The justification offered was always the same: the knowledge already existed inside the programs and further open publication would assist adversaries. No one explained why the same knowledge could not be explored safely in university settings under controlled conditions. He said contractor firms such as Booz Allen and Honeywell maintained parallel efforts that produced similar rotating field results yet never shared test configurations with one another. The separation ensured that any single leak would expose only a fragment of the overall capability. Program managers rotated every 18 months so that institutional memory stayed fragmented and no individual could assemble the full picture without approval from higher authority. The tic-tac was ours. I worked on pieces of it. Not the whole vehicle, but the power and field sections that made the reported performance possible. That is the part I can say with certainty because I held the hardware and watched the test data come off the bench. I am not asking anyone to believe every word. I am only asking that the basic experiments be allowed to happen in the open before the people who still know how to run them are gone. I have 8 months left to make that request. That is all the time I have.
These came from anonymous internet whistleblower accounts, tucked into old boards and Reddit pages where everything can vanish overnight. What stays with you is not only the craft or the beings, it is the quiet procedural detail, sealed bags, biometric doors, transcript annotations, private lab benches, and people describing impossible work like it was just another shift. That is the part that gets under the skin.